Go ahead. Mr. Balraman, 6 o'clock. Shall we start?
Go ahead.
Very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Very warm welcome to another edition of our evening talk, and where MMA, in collaboration with Ponds Veterans, is bringing it to you for the last few Saturdays regularly, every Saturday without fail. We have got excellent feedback for this event. I could honestly confess the branding of MMA has gone really very high, bringing in some outstanding speakers from all over the world. And we'll continue to do so because your program has been fixed almost till the November. We identified speakers. Thanks to Mr. Balraman, and I'll do that again every time we keep talking about this. Before I call upon the speakers and the thing who had already joined us for this evening, again, a very, very interesting subject. It's a very thought-provoking theme. Think, nudge, nudge. I want to quickly tell you only there are two events, major events. One is on the 3rd of September. We are doing an event with policing in COVID time beyond. We had former CBI Director Mr. Raghavan, along with him Mr. Sivanandan, former DGP of Maharashtra, and Meera, former DGP. This is one other event. Another event also we'll share with you a detail which we got finally this morning is we are also joining Indo-German Business Dialogue. It's happening on the 16th of September from Berlin, where the German ambassador to India and also our ambassador and the Minister of Finance will be talking to us, and where our rep MMA, two of them, our president, Mr. Ravi Purushottam, and also Daimler CEO. So this is all the thing we are going at national level to connect to the global audience, and I think it's a great indeed honor for MMA to be invited to join this firm nationally. Thank you so much. And coming to this evening, again, as I mentioned, very interesting topic, very relevant to the present pandemic. Think, nudge, nudge. There are interesting insights which will travel. Let me have the privilege of welcoming the distinguished guest for this evening, Mr. Balraman, past president of MMA, former MD and Ponds veteran, and Mr. M.S. Narayanan, principal advisor, Gateway Sydney, Australia. Ramya Ramesh is an economist, and she's also author. She's going to write regularly a few articles for us in MMA business mandate. Then Mr. Atul Vora, regional managing director, Solera Holdings, Dallas. He's joined us from USA. As you all know, Mr. Narayan has joined us from Australia. And before I call upon Mr. Balraman to say a few words, set the context, let me have the privilege of briefly introducing Mr. Balraman. Mr. Balraman is an MBA from IIM Ahmedabad, former director of Hindustan Liver, MD Ponds with a stint in Polaris Group, passionate about management development, was an energetic president of MMA, Madras Management Association, and for 2 years, and continued to be engaging with us. That's one of the reasons we have been able to do good, and speaker in several management seminars and conferences, devoted to human development, created the brand HR software company, and also currently chairman and director of several corporate boards. Enjoys coaching, mentoring, leading, helping build brands, consult marketing through boardroom advantage, and also a mission to inspire leadership development. Under his guidance and various input what has been given by Mr. Balraman, the push what is given, we launched a 24 weeks masterclass course, which got inaugurated and which got the first session commenced today. They'll be carrying on for the next 24 weeks, and we have got excellent response because outstanding content and great facilitators. Thank you so much, Mr. Balraman, for all the help and guidance which you have been able to achieve all our objective, which has been set forth by the past presidents and you in particular. Over to Mr. Balraman to set the context and also introduce the speaker. Over to you, Mr. Balraman.
Thank you, Captain. A warm welcome to all participants. MS and I used to work together in Ponds several years ago. And he migrated to Australia. And I did visit him there once. And MS is a phenomenal brain, someone with various intellectual interests, and an extremely human person. So I'm extremely happy to have him. I'm happy to have Atul Vora as well, who is a very, very warm colleague and close friend. So this is a global seminar. I mean, Atul Vora in Dallas Texas in United States, and MS Narayanan in Sydney, Australia, and in the middle are we in India. Uh, Now, today's hero is MS Narayan. And MS, what is this subject? Think, think, nudge, nudge. When my wife asked me what is the subject today, I said it is think, think, nudge, nudge. She said, look, it reminds me of ourselves. You keep thinking all the time, and I keep nudging you of various things that have got to be done in the day. So, is it something between you and your wife that made you name this think, think, nudge, nudge?
Not exactly, but now that you mention it, it well could become something to worry about in the future.
Yeah. So, warm welcome, MS. And we are all very curious as to what is in store for us because you have picked our curiosity with your title. And we all know that you always have some birthday kind of surprise waiting for us. Can you unpackage the surprise? Go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. I consider it an honor to be invited to address this group. And I want to thank Group Captain Vijay Kumar and also Mr. Balraman, whose boundless energy and enthusiasm has just inspired this series of talks from colleagues of mine from Pons and myself. Pons was my first job after university. And looking back, I've been now working for over 40 years, and it was probably the best job. It was a unique company. It had tremendous leadership. Most companies talk of people as their most important assets. Pons was one of those companies that actually believed it, and you felt that belief, and people paid back in different ways, but always were rewarded both psychically as well as other ways by the company. It just was a magnet. You know, they say one of the ways you know whether you enjoy your work or not is whether you look forward to the weekend more than look forward to Monday. This was one place where you actually look forward to what the Monday would bring, what was going to be exciting, something good to do, quite unique. And I felt privileged to have been part of that. And now we've come full circle, and I feel privileged to be part of this series of talks and reliving those memories with people who shared that experience with us all those years ago. So with that introductory words, let me turn to the subject at hand. But before that, a couple of housekeeping points. First of all, the views that I express are entirely mine, do not represent the views of my employer, the MMA, or anybody else but myself. The second point I just want to make is about 10 or 15 minutes into this presentation, into this chat, I'm going to stop for a brief moment, just to have a little bit of a conversation. So it's not just me talking for the next 53 minutes or so. That's not the end of the presentation. I will continue after that, and we'll have questions at the end. So, and questions. Questions are very important. It reminds me of the little boy who asked his father, Papa, the moon rotates on its axis, but why is it on Earth we only see one side of the moon? And the father, being an honest father and a good father, said, son, I don't really know. Yes. A little later, the son asks his father, Father, I read somewhere that the universe is expanding. What is it expanding into? And the father said, again, honestly, I really don't know, son. And so time went, and then the son came back and said, Papa, and he stopped. And the father said, no, go on, ask questions. If you don't ask questions, how will you learn? I'll now begin to share my screen. And Now, I consciously titled this to leave a little bit of suspense as to the subject that I was going to talk to. But in a nutshell, what I want to talk to you about is how recent insights into how people think is affecting you and me and all of us, and how governments and organizations are using this thinking to push us towards certain decisions that are often for our benefit and sometimes not so much for our benefit. It so happens that last week when Mr. Shamsundar talked to you, he mentioned some of these concepts. I will build on these a bit more and then take you, but not in the context of investing as he was talking, but in a more broader general sense in terms of everyday life. So let me begin. When you turn 50 in Australia, you get a test kit that looks like this. It's a bowel cancer test kit. It's free. It costs 10 or 15 minutes. It costs nothing. It takes 10 or 15 minutes. And it comes with a letter that says, every week, 80 Australians die of bowel cancer. They say, if you use this test, send it in, which is completely free, you get the results. The chances are that you can identify cancer much before symptoms are otherwise displayed. And in reality, you could save your life. They advertise it on TV, they beg you, they beseech you, the government, to fill in this, to take the test, to basically send some samples in and get tested. And they send this every 2 years. Now, there is no conceivable reason why I wouldn't want to do this. Yet, in the last 10 years, I have never done it. I don't, they offer you the option of withdrawing from the program. They say, if you don't want to be bothered, please tell us. But I don't take that. I know it's good for me. I know it might save my life. But yet, I put this aside saying, I will do it, and I don't. I consider myself a reasonably sensible person, somebody who sometimes on occasion, my organization trusts me to make decisions that affect hundreds, if not thousands of people, millions of dollars in expenditure. And yet when it comes to making this simple decision that could save my life, I don't seem to be making it. And I'm not the only one. It turns out that 58% of Australians don't send the test kit back. And you'd assume most of these are really sensible people. People who know that if they're hungry, they should eat, or if it's raining, to get out of the rain. Why don't sensible people do sensible things that could possibly save their lives? Let me ask you a question, and I'm not really looking for an answer, but just think for a minute the answer to this question that I'm going to ask you. If you were deciding today, that is Saturday the 29th, what you wanted for dessert next Saturday, do you want fruit or do you want chocolate? I don't know about you, but most people in the test that was run, most people, about 74% of people, choose fruit. Then the researchers changed the question around, and they asked, if you were deciding today what you wanted for tonight, and most people chose chocolate. So clearly, we know what is good for us, but we discount future benefit just as a fresh MBA discounts a cash flow. Similarly, how often do many of us say we're going to join the gym? But it's always tomorrow, mañana, as the Spanish say. And mañana never comes. Let me ask you another question. And think for what the answer would be. So this bat and ball together costs $1.10, right? $1.10 is the total cost of a bat and a ball. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Now, I'm not going to ask for an answer, but if you were honest and if you are human, you probably thought to yourself that the ball costs 10 cents. Over half of Princeton graduates, when this test was run, said that. The same with the University of Michigan graduates in the United States. And 10 cents is, of course, the wrong answer. Now, if you ask this question in an HSC exam or even a class 10 exam or a class 8 exam, students would get it correct. But a question is asked by a random presenter on a Saturday afternoon, and instinctively, and I'm sure you're not the only ones, most people jump to an answer. There's something nice about 10 cents and $1, and it seems like the right answer, and we jump to the answer of 10 cents. We are lazy in how we apply our mind. We could easily work out that the answer is not 10 cents, but we don't. We go to the simple, easy, obvious. It just feels right. So the word Homo sapiens in Latin means wise men, wise man. To make a dreadful pun, are we more Homo Simpsons than Homo sapiens? We do make bad decisions, even though we know there are better alternatives. Why do we do this? What can we and what should others, such as policymakers, do about this? It's not rocket science to say that policymakers need to understand how people behave. I mean, it's obvious, right? If you're making public policy that is going to change how government delivers their services and how we expect citizens to behave, the norms we expect citizens to follow, we need to understand how people behave. Now, what behavioral insights, which is the subject of this talk today, which is understanding how human beings actually behave rather than how they should behave or how laboratories think they should behave, says that first of all, our behavior is not directed to an objective real world. Our behavior is directed to our own idiosyncratic representation of what we think the world is. I'll give you an example of that. You may offer me an incentive to do something. I might find that insulting. You may think you're being extremely generous. Another example is I may be afraid of flying. Though objectively, flying is probably the safest form of transport. The other thing we do, we overestimate our mental capacities, to use the jargon, today's jargon, our bandwidth. So, for example, people talk hands-free on the phone, say in Australia or the US. In India, I know most people have drivers, but your driver answers the phone when he is driving you around the town. Research suggests that your reaction times and your ability to detect peripheral objects when you're answering the phone, even if it's hands-free, is roughly comparable to being legally intoxicated. Think about that the next time your driver answers the phone. Context is critical. How we think and how we react depends on the context. That seems fairly, straightforward and simple to understand. A couple of researchers, Mullainathan and Shafir, in the 2013 book called Scarcity, came to some stunning conclusions. By the way, Professor Mullainathan won the Infosys Prize in 2018 and is now a professor in Harvard. Anyway, this conclusion, what they did in this book was they looked at how your mental capacity can be consumed by conflicting demands. So they went to this group of Indian farmers before the harvest, when cash is strapped, when you're still looking to make sure you can harvest your crop and get the money from the market. And then they tested their IQ then, and they tested their IQ after the harvest. And they found that before the harvest, their IQ was statistically significantly lower. So just thinking about the fact that you may or may not have money affects your ability to make a decision and to even succeed in an intelligence test. And it's not just Indian farmers. They ran some tests with people in the UK, and it wasn't even a real expenditure. They told people, tomorrow you have to spend £1,000 on fixing your car. And it sort of triggered some mental processes in people to the extent that they lost 10 to 15 points of IQ in answering on IQ tests, just thinking about the possibility that they had to deal with this expense the next day. That's a staggering concept. If you were to take it to its extreme, you would say, it's not that foolish choices make you poor. Poverty's effects on your mind leads to bad choices. So these are some of the things that behavioral insights are telling us. So in theory then, if we can understand how humans think and how we behave, we then may be able to recognize these, and maybe we can develop highly adaptive and forgiving programs that would be more effective. So before we go to the fun stuff, and I promise you will, at least I think it's fun stuff, it's useful, I think, to understand some of the theoretical frameworks that, first of all, acknowledge that people are not laboratory boiled specimens that behave in ways that an economist would consider rational. People are not robots, and economists who recognize that have come up with some models of how people behave, and we'll talk briefly about those. Secondly, if we have a conceptual basis to understand how people behave, perhaps we can find ways to overcome limitations. Just as in the physical world, we can't fly, but we can build machines that do. In the same way, perhaps, we can find ways to overcome our cognitive limitations. And this knowledge is of value for designers of public policy, people like myself, or like people who took the initiatives to send me that bowel cancer test. Maybe they can figure out how to make me and the other 58% of Australians who don't fill it in to actually submit the test. Now, I should mention at this point in time that I'm not an economist. I'm not a psychologist. In the words of J.D. Salinger, the American novelist, I'm an amateur reader, somebody who reads and runs. I don't work in a behavioral insights team, though, but I've been for many years a member of the New South Wales Business Behavioral Insight Community of Practice, and have been watching this field develop over the last 8 years in New South Wales. What I am, though, is a policymaker, somebody who makes policies. And I believe that some of these techniques that I'm going to talk about have real benefits in helping me find solutions to some of the wicked problems that policymakers need to develop. This slide mentions in a catchy New Yorker title, the two friends who change how we think. But before I talk about these two people, I just want to call out a predecessor, Herbert Simon, also a Nobel Prize winner, who first articulated the theory of bounded rationality. And what Herbert Simon said is, people don't maximize utility. They often are happy with a less than max optimum solution. They're happy to satisfice. Now, Bernoulli, who's familiar to engineers as fluid mechanics, actually came up with this theory of maximizing utility in the 1700s. And for 200 years, it was taken as a given. This is what economists did. They thought all people behave rationally and they make decisions on maximizing their utility. Then in Herbert Simon pointed out that there's some boundaries in rationality. And then it sort of lay dormant for many years till these two guys, who are not economists, but psychologists, Daniel Kahneman and Ivor Tversky, who in 1979 published a paper that shook the world of economics. And this is called prospect theory. Now, prospect theory basically says two things. It says, or not two, it says several things, but some of the things it says are, first of all, people make decisions based on the fact that they hate losses more than they love gains. Let me explain that. What they argue is that I hate losing $20 more. The pain I get from losing $20 is much greater than the joy I get from winning $20. To make them equal, I need to win $40. So in other words, I hate losing much more than I enjoy winning. The second thing is how much you care about your wins and losses depends on your starting point. Are you starting with a certain amount of wealth, say $10,000, or are you starting with $1,000? And the decisions you make, even though objectively you stand to win or lose the same $100, depends on what you're starting with. Now, that seems like a very sensible logic. A sensible person on the street would think that's very sensible. But it was new to economists to actually accept that. The other thing they called out was people, when they make decisions, tend to overestimate small probabilities. So if you send to somebody, there's a 99% chance of something happening, people in their minds tend to think of it as maybe a 90 or a 95% and behave accordingly. In the same way, if you say to somebody, there's only a 1% chance of something happening, people in their minds tend to think of it as 5 or 10% chance and behave accordingly. Finally, Kahneman and Tversky called out something they call heuristics. Now, I might use this word, I'll try and avoiding the word heuristic, but it means a mental shortcut to make a decision. And we'll talk a little more about heuristics as we go around, these mental shortcuts, but we will talk more about them because that's germane to the subject of this talk. Daniel Kahneman, as everybody knows, wrote the best-selling book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which I suspect most of the people on this call have read. It was a wonderful bestseller, and he did win the Nobel Prize. And the two, actually, if you've got a spare 38 minutes, I strongly encourage you someday when you've got that time to listen to his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, because it articulates these concepts that I talked to you so much better than I ever could. You remember that New York article that I mentioned on the previous slide about Kahneman and Tversky? That article was written by these two guys, Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. And what they did when they published this book in 2008 was they took Kahneman and Tversky's concepts and packaged them nicely and built on them. And they published this bestseller called Nudge. And what nudge theory is, it takes those heuristics or those mental shortcuts that people do and categorize and identify a number of these heuristics. And then they said, if we know that people think irrationally, and if we know that people, when they think irrationally, tend to follow a pattern, then maybe we can actually design choices based on how people think to actually help them make better decisions. So I'll just say that again. What they're saying is people think irrationally, but they don't do so completely randomly. There are patterns in how these irrational decisions are made. So if we can identify those, we can design, we can offer people choices that are designed to push people down certain paths. But there were certain principles that they had in when they articulated this nudge theory. First and foremost, they said this is about freedom of choice. This is not about compulsion. Nudge theory is not about forcing people to do something that they don't want. It is simply showing people or helping people to make a decision, hopefully in their good, for their good, without compelling them to do so. So to give you an example, a traditional form of thinking might be to tell people, you shall not litter, or you'll be fined $500, as might happen in Singapore. In the nudge world, what you would do is you would make lots of rubbish bins available and make them highly visible. In the traditional world, you might say, I'm going to ban junk food. In a nudge world, what you would do is you wouldn't ban junk food, but you'd push it to the back of the counter and you'd put fruit at the eye level so the child, as they line up in the cafeteria, is first attracted to fruit rather than the junk food that they might otherwise pick. Similarly, counting calories. As my dietitian tells me, if you use a smaller plate, you will eat less. And that's a classic example of a nudge. So nudges are not mandates. And the concept that the authors of nudge theory articulated was about what they call libertarian paternalism. Of course, there's a degree of being paternal, but it's about freedom of choice. And that's important to remember as we talk about how people are actually using it. And in their view, nudge theory was for good, for making the community better. Scientists always think that when they split the atom, nobody foresee that they would lead to the atomic bomb. In the same way, you'll see that the genie has escaped the bottle of always being used for good. Richard Taylor, by the way, won the Nobel Prize in 2017. And he said he would spend the money as irrationally as he possibly could. Here are an example of a couple of these mental shortcuts. The first one is when you're faced with a question to which you don't know the answer. You need some sort of starting point and then you make adjustment till you reach a conclusion that you think sensible. So the example I've got here is a real one. This is from one of my charities, right? They send me a letter asking me to contribute. And they give me options, 25, 50, 100, or other dollars, or whatever. Now, without that nudge, I might be tempted to start with, $5 or $10 or some lower number. But now I'm sort of anchored to thinking it's an effort for me to give less than 25. A similar thing happens in something where people have no idea. For example, the experiments have been run where people were asked to guess the population of a random city in China that nobody had ever heard of. But before they were asked that, there was a conversation about something else where 3 million as a number was tossed about in a completely different context. And then people were asked, can you guess the population of this city in China? And what happened? Most of the guesses were centered around 3 million, either a bit lower or a bit higher. That's an example of a mental shortcut. When we have no idea what we're doing, we look for an anchor, and then we sort of make adjustments till we think it sounds broadly sensible. Another example of a heuristic or a mental shortcut is this tendency to stick with the status quo. We have a tendency to stay committed to the current situation, maybe because it's a fear of the unknown, or we just can't be bothered to do so, or because we're scared by complexity. So the classic example, and this one we will be referring to several times over the course of this presentation, is in how you register to be an organ donor. Now, in many countries, say in Australia, when you sign up for your driver's license, you have to tick a box saying, I agree to be an organ donor. But in other countries, it's the other way around. You have to say, I do not agree to be an organ donor. When people are asked to opt out, a large percentage of people tend to accept the status quo or the default choice. In other words, the power of defaults is very, very strong. And so these are two examples of these sort of mental shortcuts. I might stop here just to have a discussion to start you thinking about what these sorts of mental shortcuts are. I will give you one other example, just to show you that these shortcuts that we use are not always bad. The example I'd like you to think about is a fielder in a cricket match. A ball is hit from the center of the field, from the center of the pitch, and it's traveling up into the air and it's headed towards the boundary. And the fielder, he or she, has to work out in their mind, in a split second, the velocity at which the ball is traveling, the spin that has been imparted, the trajectory the ball is taking, the angle of the wind, and position his or herself to the point to catch the ball at the point where it's dropping from the ceiling, from the sky, and make the decision instinctively, not by using Newton's physics or Galileo's geometry, but instinctively using a heuristic. And if they drop the ball, they also know to blame the lights of the stadium. Those are the sorts of things that I'm asking. Can we spend maybe a few minutes asking people to suggest that come to mind as mental shortcuts that we unconsciously use every day without even thinking about it.
I request Anu and Ramya to come on screen, please, for a few interactions. Anu Oza, HR Director. I missed introducing you, Anu. Anu Oza is HR Director. She also one of the special invitees for this evening. Yes, over to all of them on screen now. Thank you.
Yeah, we are continuing after this. This is just a small break, and the speaker is continuing.
Yeah, so may I say something, MS?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, so I think one of the mental shortcuts that I use fairly often is when I purchase stuff from a large online retailer, and they are gently nudging me towards a particular choice of books, and I sometimes just unconsciously sign up for that.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, if I can comment on that, Netflix gives you about 10 suggestions. And most of the viewers tend to actually pick from those 10. So Netflix is basically nudging you towards choosing something out of a choice of 10, even though they've got a collection of hundreds and hundreds of choices.
Something to this.
Sorry, go ahead, Ramya.
Ramya.
Yeah, so you give an example of cricket and mental shortcuts. Now, I'm a shuttle player as well. I play badminton for my pleasure. And one thing I realized that is the more I experiment with my shots, the more I practice, the more I do something, the better the shot comes. So it's more instinctive after a particular point of time rather than something that happens before I start practicing. So the more you practice, maybe the better your shortcuts are. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, that's actually a fantastic point, because how did, these heuristics that we developed, how did we develop these? Well, many of them are because of the process of evolution. when our ancestor was being chased by a saber-toothed cat, our ancestor didn't calculate the velocity or the angle of the slope or the velocity of the saber-toothed tiger, but made an instinctive choice and ran in a certain direction. And if our ancestor made the wrong choice, the ancestor got eaten. So, these heuristics that we develop are actually very helpful in most cases. And some, in the case of muscle memory or, in badminton, that's something that's developed through practice. Some things we have instinctively acquired through evolution.
Hey, MS.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. No, you first.
No, go on, please.
I was just going to say, as always, fascinating to chat with my my partner in crime, MS. But the question I have for you is a little contrarian. I get it, and I love the idea of heuristics and nudge. But what happens when you need to force change, and time is of the essence? And the example, obviously, that we're all living through is the world of COVID-19.
Yeah. Atul, if I can, may I answer your question in two parts? The first answer is, when it's necessary to force change, there is no option but to force when it's necessary. In terms of how nudge can be used in COVID, maybe I can come back to it at the end of this talk if we have time.
Okay, perfect. No, I just wanted to plant that kind of little contrarian thought there.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, MS, please move on.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm not going to, Taylor and Kent in their book called out a number of heuristics, and I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I did mention the status quo. I mentioned anchoring, loss aversion, I sort of mentioned earlier, optimism bias. I mean, we're all familiar with optimism. Have you ever known a project manager to say that the project won't come in under budget and on time? Most projects don't, but people seem to believe that. And following the herd, people like do what others do. So these are some of the heuristics. And we might leave this theory behind at this stage. I think the important takeaways are there are patterns in the way people make decisions, even if they're irrational. And if you know what they are, you can use them to nudge people or help people make certain decisions, hopefully in their good. So let me return to my story. The Nudge book was published in 2008, and David Cameron, remember him, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, was a big fan of this book. In fact, the story is he used to ask all his MPs to read the book. And in 2010, he established what's known as the first behavioral insights unit in the UK government. It was known as either the Behavioral Insights Team or it was known as the Nudge Unit. And it had an operating budget of £500,000 a year. And David Cameron challenged them to produce a 10-fold return on investment or be shut down after 2 years. They had Richard Taylor as an advisor. I'm told unpaid. I don't know how they managed that. They must have nudged him in. But as it turns out, the BIT team saved 22 times its running cost. It was a massive success. And as a result, this concept of a central government nudge team of behavioral has spread around the world. In 2017, the OECD published a report identifying 100 case studies from over 202 units across the world. So it's everywhere. All over the world, people are using these behavioral insights to influence public policy and make and also in commerce, as we shall see. In 2018, the World Bank published a study and called out some of the leaders. They include Australia, Canada, Denmark, Peru, Singapore, UK, and the US. And we'll look at some of the examples from these as we go along. But just on the left-hand side of the screen, you will see a Google Ngram I ran a couple of days ago. And you will see that the searches in nudge theory continue to grow as year after year after year. There's a huge amount of interest in this area, and it's growing. So what did these 202 nudge units actually accomplish? Here are some examples. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I might talk about a couple of them. First, there's an example from the UK. They increased tax receipts by $70 million a month. Now, how did they do something like this? This is one of the early interventions that is quite common. Not this particular one, but similar. What you do is, if you're a defaulter, you get a letter saying, Mr. Narayan, 90% of people in Sydney have paid their taxes on time. We note you have not. Can you please pay by this date? And people who get a certain percentage of people who get that letter actually respond. A week or two later, you get a second letter if you haven't responded, saying, in your suburb, everyone has paid their taxes other than yourself, or something to that effect. And that sort of second reminder that actually brings it down even from the whole of the state or the whole of the city to almost within your suburb, nudges you into thinking, oh my God, you remember I talked of following the herd? You feel left out and you're nudged to actually comply with the law. So that's a classic example of a nudge. You know, this can also backfire if instead of saying most people have paid their taxes on time, you say, you know, we're trying to get some people who haven't paid their taxes to pay. People think, yeah, I'm not the only one. That's okay then. I can keep not doing it. I want to draw your attention. The UK had a massive success with organ donors, not through the opt-out method, but a completely different method. And I will come back to you. I'll come back to talk about that example a little later. But I want to draw your attention to the very last dot point on this slide. An 84% reduction in suicide attempts in Tokyo train stations by using blue LED lights. That's sensational. Now, nobody will deny that the best way to actually reduce suicide attempts in train stations is protective barriers. They cost a lot of money, but it costs much less to simply have blue LED lights. And there was a dramatic reduction in suicide attempts. There is some argument if you look in the literature, whether it's 84% or some other number, but there was a reduction just by changing to LED lights. And that has now been, that experiment has now spread to other parts of the world. I think there's blue lights in a rail crossing in Scotland and some other places. So some of the common features of these are using those heuristics, those mental shortcuts, and also low cost. These are low cost interventions. Letters, frequent letters, blue LED lights. These are not the big capital intensive investments, but small interventions, which can easily be done. So we've seen some results. What were some of the actual nudges? Even though we talked about a theory that actually was articulated in the last 10 years or so, thinking about human behavior started a long time ago. The earliest, one of the earliest examples is in line marking. Now, I know line marking doesn't work really well, all that well, perhaps in India, but it's perhaps the single most effective road safety device around the world. And it started, well, there's a couple of stories as to how it started, but the story I like is the one where a doctor, a lady doctor in California, was driving along the road and she was nearly run off the road by a truck coming the other direction. She decided to do something about it, and she painted the road down the middle of the road herself. And that spread around the world. And it saved millions and millions of lives, because by artificially reducing the width of the road or the width of the lane, people follow that. Another example of nudge behavior is the Keep Singapore Clean campaign. This started way back in 1968, well before prospect theory or any of that. It was a massively successful. Here's one I love. In this nudge, what happens is that this is a busy street in Stockholm, and the speed limit is 25 miles per hour. Anybody who goes over the speed limit is fined. And the people who go at the speed limit or below get to go into a lottery to get a share of the fines. The result, average speed dropped from 32 miles per hour to 25 miles per hour in this location. Ladies, I must apologize. I'm taking you to one of the horriblest, most awful places on the planet, the inside of a men's public toilet. But this is one of the most famous nudges of them all. By simply painting a fly on the urinal, Amsterdam airport reduced spillage by 80%. People clearly like something to aim at, which I suppose is the purpose of all those performance discussions you have with your subordinates and your managers. I talked to you about the organ donor success that the UK had. So what they did is they increased the number of organ donors, that is people signing up to be an organ donor, by 96,000 people a year. Now, how do they actually do this? All these nudges have one common feature. There's always a problem, then there are some alternative hypotheses, and there are randomized controlled trials to test these hypotheses to determine which is the best one. So in this case, what you're looking at is you can't read the data, but what you're looking at is a screenshot of the web page at which you land if you want to register. You pay your annual car tax, or you want to sign up to be a driver test, to test for a driver test. And so what the nudge unit did is they created 9 different versions, and a certain proportion of the people saw each one of those different versions. The base version said basically, thank you, and please join the organ donor program. One of the other examples, which I've called out here, says 3 people a day die because there are not enough organ donors. And then this one over here, the last one said, if you needed an organ donor, if you needed an organ transplant, would you have one? If so, please help others. And the test ran for 5 weeks, cost nothing. It's just a web page. And the difference between the base case, which is this one, and the one which was ultimately picked, which is this one, which is the one about if you needed an organ transplant, which is the reciprocity heuristic. You know, if you do something to people, they like to do something back. That seemed to work best in this case. It increased the organ donor registration by 96,000. Now, 96, that's just people on a register. It doesn't mean it saved 96,000 people. But every organ donor saves between 4 to 9 people's lives. And there's always a shortage of organ donor. Assume as a result, now of these 90, there are large numbers of people on the organ donor registry, but in a year in the UK, about 5,000 people die in a way that their organs can be harvested. So assume this campaign increased that by, say, 10%. 15 words on a web page saved 500 lives. I can't remember when I wrote 15 words that saved 500 lives. Can you? Maybe not. I talked about smaller plates earlier, and they reduce food waste in an experiment in hotel buffet restaurants by 22%. Remember how I talked about my dietitian telling me to do that? That's the first thing she tells me, smaller portions. Google in their innovation labs ran a similar experiment, had smaller plates, and the people in the team actually lost weight. Here's another fun one. It's a way to get people to dispose of the cigarette litter, cigarette butts in London. And you had to choose between picking Ronaldo or Messi and vote with your cigarette butts. Fun game? Yes. Result? A 74% reduction in litter. And another way to make it fun is to get people to dispose of their chewing gum thoughtfully, or you make it fun to dispose of recycling, compost, and landfill using a basketball hoop as a nudge. You know, when I lived in India, I lived about 5 kilometers from my work. I had this most wonderful driver, old man, most gentle and lovely person. But once he got behind the wheel, he became a maniac. I counted in that 5 kilometers one day, with no traffic, he honked 38 times. It used to drive me nuts. Here's a test run by a behavioral insights team in India. What they did is they had this little button here that flashed red and beeped every time you blew the horn. And you had to turn it off every time you blew the horn. As a result, 61% reduction in indiscreet honking in India. Quite an interesting YouTube if you want to Google it. This is Copenhagen. You remember what I said earlier on about making rubbish bins highly visible and also pointing them out? By painting these footmarks on the ground, they reduced street litter by 46%. Reminding people can help them do the right things. You know, these are attempts to do that, to remind people that it's a lot more healthy to take the stairs, that stair climbing burns more calories per minute than tennis, that it can protect your heart, and so on. And these work. But let me now share with you my favorite example of how people were nudged to take the stairs. Now, this particular video has been watched 1.5 million times, so some of you may have seen it, but like me, you probably won't mind seeing it again. virus has spread to Milan, Melbourne, Istanbul, KL, and Auckland when I last checked. But nudges are not just in public policy. People have employed nudges in business as well. For example, Virgin Atlantic saved 6,800 metric tons of fuel by nudging their captains. They divided this was a test run by their behavioral psychologists. They employed some behavioral psychologists to run these tests. What they did is they told some captains, some of the captains, we're going to monitor your fuels. Others, they gave them a target. Still others, they said, if you beat the target, we'll donate some money to charity. Compared to the base group, those who were given target or those who were told there was going to be a saving donated to charity, were able to save 6,800 tons of fuel over the course of the test, or 3.5 million pounds at the date on which it happened. Another example this is Lemonade. And Lemonade is a disruptor in the insurance industry in the United States. I think they just went through an IPO. And they call out two things. They say their business is based on AI and behavioral insights. They actually have a chief behavioral officer on their team. And they do many of the things that nudge theory has always said, which is, when you fill in a form, people are more honest if you ask them to sign their name at the start of the form than at the end. They're less likely to lie. So Lemonade has been using techniques such as these, and it's quite unique. Now, there are some people who are calling it the Tesla of the insurance industry. I'm not sure whether that's hype, but it's a business to watch out for. And it's just recently expanded into Europe. There's nudges everywhere. Marketers know how to exploit, for example, anchoring. Here in the example, IKEA is telling you that their coffee maker is just about how much it costs you to park for a day. We are all familiar with Bata's, 399 or pricing. We're also familiar with, here in this example, New York Times is comparing the cost of the subscription to the Times with a chocolate sundae. So there's nudges everywhere. And here's an example of where this company is pushing people to its most popular plan. So they're relying on anchoring, first giving somebody a starting point, and also by saying it's most popular, they're relying on this social herd heuristic. Now, presumably, that plan is the one that makes them most profit. How do you build a nudge? Well, you frame the problem, as I said. You design experiments, you perform randomized control trials, you interpret the results. You have to be careful of what's called the Dewey-Quine problem, because when you do an experiment, you don't know whether it's the experiment or the initiative that was wrong or the way it was implemented, and you have to manage that and then finally implement it. And there are various techniques, and I'm not going to go over it, but it's things like using defaults, attracting attention, make it social, make it timely, do it, things like that. But I'm not going to go into detail. Let me move on to some cautions and observations. One of the questions that might come to people is, what's the difference between nudging and traditional marketing? I think the objective in nudging is fundamentally to benefit people. It's focusing on what's best for people, but there's no compulsion. Whereas in marketing, the objective is to maximize profit, focus on what's to be sold. We're talking big budgets, and ideally want to push rather than nudge. Whereas in nudging, it's about low-cost interventions. It's important for the nudger to be trusted. Look at this example from Amazon. They're pushing me to accept this option, the middle option. Now, if that's not really the best option for me, trust will eventually break down. Other consideration to think about, one size doesn't fit all. Why doesn't every country in the world adopt an opt-out organ donation system? Because it's not just having people on a register, but it's all the other parts of the system also have to work. You don't just change the behavior of people to sign up to be on a register, but you have to change the behaviors of the the doctors, the hospitals, everyone, the whole system behavior has to be changed. And that is why Spain is so successful, but perhaps countries such as Bulgaria and Luxembourg have some of the lowest rates of disease donation, even though they have no process. The other thing is that, what works in one case doesn't always work again. Here's the Australian Red Cross increased the number of blood donors by sending a cheap pen along with a mail out. So they wrote a letter to potential donors, includes a pen, and they went from 0.5% to 1.5% as blood donors. Guess what? The story went around, and then last week, it got 3 of these pens from charities I don't know. So what am I doing with them? I'm sending them back. You can't just copy what works for somebody else and assume it's going to work. Finally, welcome to the dark side. We talked about the people who invented nudge or thought about nudge as a way to do good for community, but obviously anything can be misused. And here are some classic examples. North Carolina, for example, limited the types of ID that could be used to register to vote. And critics say this keeps Black voters away. I don't know if you read about the UK's new campaign, the Back to Work or Risk Losing Your Job. They're going to start that next week. It was announced today. So basically, they're telling people that if you don't go back to work, your manager may forget who you are, and therefore you may be the first person to get sacked. I think that's quite malicious. Facebook ran a clandestine test in India in, I think, 2012 on 700,000 people. Half the people they showed for a week all sorts of negative things, and positive things for the other, to see what they call emotional contagion. I would have been furious to be a guinea pig in that test. We're familiar with fake news in social media that's constantly nudging you all the time in one direction or the other. Finally, sludge. Sludge is where it's easy to join something, but almost impossible to get out of it. So it's easy to sign up to some websites, but it's so difficult to get out of it that you have to stick with it. And I don't know if you know, but PayPal, which we use, I know in India people use Paytm, but PayPal, its terms of acceptance are longer than Hamlet. Who's going to read all that? And that's an example of sludge. So what's next for BI? This is called the Gartner hype cycle, and it says, well, we've had early mass hype, and now there's starting to be some negative press, and maybe we're going to go through this trough of disillusionment. Maybe, maybe not. I'm not so pessimistic myself. Of those 202 units around the world, a lot of them are just starting out. I don't believe they've actually even gathered the benefits from the low-hanging fruits, the change in forms, the improvement in organ donors, the improvement in tax collection, the improvement in complying with litter, or all these sorts of the low-hanging fruit. Whereas the more advanced groups, like people like units in Australia, are dealing with more complex issues such as domestic violence and gender equality and so on. So let me sum up. We started by talking about some of the theoretical framework, and basically the takeaway from that was people don't think rationally, but they think irrationally, but in predictable ways. So people can actually design choices in such a way to take advantage of this, and people have done so in governments, in business, and they're continuing to do so, but they're doing it both for good and also for bad. So let me finish with some thoughts for you. Are you being nudged? And I will suggest to you, yes, you're being nudged every day, in every way. Do you recognize that? Do you realize that? Secondly, are you a nudger? Do you nudge other people? Have you designed your nudges keeping it with consciously understanding these sorts of behavioral insights? Would you benefit from doing so? And finally, should you consider adding nudging to your toolkit? Thank you.
Excellent, MS. Now may I invite your panel of three to interact with you. Who wants to go first?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
See, I understand the concept of nudging is almost like a win-win. In game theory, you call it non-zero sum game. How is it so different to manipulation, and how is it so different to pushing people to do something that the nudger wants to do, or the organization, or the marketer, or anyone?
It's an excellent question, and the critics of the nudge, and they are particularly there in America, where, as you know, people resist being told to do things like wear masks or social distance or whatever. There are lots of, they believe that this sort of somebody else saying what is good for me is not right. So, and it's a fair point. And when they conceived the concept, they agreed that it is paternalism. So it is saying, I do know what is better for you than you know yourself. So that criticism is valid. Can you force somebody to do something that they don't want to? Probably not. At the end of the day, the nudge theory says, give people choices. And nudge works best if it comes from somebody in authority, but also somebody you really trust. So nudge won't work really well if people don't have confidence in the nudger, say the government. If they mistrust the government, nudging is not going to be as effective. But, and can you force somebody to become an axe murderer by nudging? Probably not.
Who next?
Hey, MS.
Yeah.
No, go. No. Go.
Go ahead, Atul.
No, I just wanted, as I said earlier, it's always so fascinating to listen to MS. But I want to come back to how do you, force change when either you don't have the time, it's critical, or nudging doesn't work. And, COVID-19 is obviously one example, but it's other things as well. You can nudge your kids to tidy up their rooms all day long or years and years. And at some point, you've got to force the change because it's not going to happen. So just curious to hear your reactions to either situation, the critical or the long-standing one.
No, there's no question that nudging is not the answer in all situations. It was, I think it was Maslow who said, if your only tool is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail.
Good.
But nudging is not the solution to every problem. It cannot be. It can only work in certain situations. And there is no way that the commander of the army is going to nudge the soldiers into following their orders. However, the commander could nudge the soldiers into certain behaviors that are not related to combat, in terms of, say, how the soldier behaves when they're on outside still wearing a uniform, but outside the army base. What is the standard of behavior that's expected of them? That can be influenced through nudging, but you will never. Nudging is not the end all and do all. All it is, it's a way to recognize that by giving people certain choices, you can help them And you want, as you can see, we're talking of increases in percentage. It's never 100%. You never get 100% with a nudge. The bowel cancer guys, that letter that I get every 2 years has had nudge behavioral insights into it. It's got all these nudges in it. So it's probably brought up from 30% to 48%. But they probably need to do something more to get beyond.
Yeah.
When it comes, and that leads me on to the answer to your question about COVID, because you look, we know where it works where the two most successful countries in the world in dealing with COVID are Vietnam and Taiwan. And between the two of them, I think Vietnam is really the standout. They're 90 odd million people. They've got a death rate of 0.3 per million. In contrast, in Australia, I think we have 22. I think it's 44 in India. I think in the US, it's 550 per million. It's just, And how did they do it? The same techniques that everybody else used, contact tracing, border closure, hand washing, social distancing. So you would think that nudging would be good to change behavior and actually get people to hand wash, wear masks, social distance. But so far, say for example, in the US, it's not worked at all. I mean, the US has had a behavioral insight team since President Obama and passed an executive order in 2015. I don't know whether the current administration got rid of it or not, but it's been around the edges, and this is a war, and maybe nudging is, there have been some successes. For example, everybody in Australia knows that how to wash your hands. You have to sing happy birthday twice. Even my 2-year-old grandson knows that, So there have been some communication successes, but it's not the silver bullet for COVID. It's not.
Thanks. Yep, I agree.
In India, for tobacco, the obvious very negative nudge is to show people who have been smokers for a long time and have horrible growths in their mouths and jaws. If you see that, you'll obviously not feel like smoking.
Yeah.
So there could be very powerful negative nudges for COVID.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the things you can do for COVID are also, people understand why there are, people are not listening to the messages. First of all, there's an optimism bias. People think I'm not going to get it. Only a certain percentage of people are going to get it. People think that there's this social herd thing that, only about 20% of American men don't wear masks because they think you're not macho if you don't wear masks. If you wear a mask, you're not macho enough. You're not brave. There are people have to deal with the economic consequences of COVID, and they say, I have to deal with the present bias. I have to deal with feeding my family today. I can't be worried about catching a disease tomorrow. So these are complex issues, and they're not all easy to deal with. And that's what the communication is trying to, but it's not an easy one.
And just to reinforce your point, I made the contrarian point just to get the debate going. But the truth of the matter is, we have not, nudge could work in a complementary fashion, and we've not had it because our leaders nudge the wrong behavior. I mean, they just do. Our president is the one who starts that out, and it's not only him, all opinion leaders. So culturally, if you adopt masks like East Asia does, we would be much further along.
Yeah, in Taiwan, for example, if you don't wear a mask, your photo will pop up in social media just by others, and people, it's a huge social pressure to comply with those norms. You couldn't do it in Australia. You couldn't do it in America. Sorry, Anu.
Yeah. No, I think this conversation was absolutely brilliant in terms of economics public policy and actual human behavior, which is assuming that human beings are not rational all the time. In fact, they're rarely rational. I just wanted to share an example from organization development with you, MS, and ask you whether you think that this applies to nudging or not. One of the world's most famous fast-moving consumer goods companies recently achieved the very enviable target of having 50% women in the managerial cadre globally, right across the board. Now, they did 4 things. One is that this was personally endorsed by the CEO, not necessarily by HR, but led by the CEO of every country. The second is that the recruitment teams were primed in order to reduce bias. The third is there were clear targets given, just as you were talking about the Virgin Atlantic pilots and the targets they were given. And the fourth is that every single accomplishment was celebrated. So looking at it from an OD perspective, this massive cultural transformation, do you think this would come under the rubric of nudging?
It's nudging is a way in which you can achieve these kinds of things, and it's a way of behavior change. And in fact, I think it's actually the future of nudging. People actually apply these nudge concepts for change management within the organization.
Okay.
One of the examples
we need to open it to the public because 90% of our speakers finish on time. So, group captain. Hello.
Thank you so much, sir.
Captain,
thank you.
The time you finish on time, so you have 9 minutes.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We have large number of viewers, over 1,100 viewers are watching this program from our social media portals, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. And viewers, you've got a lot of questions. We'll try and accommodate as many questions as possible. First question from the chat box itself, then I'll move on to the Facebook. Nudging is often misunderstood to nagging. How do we avoid such a delicate situation when the core message is misunderstood?
Group captain, you have better questions than that. Please go down the line.
Yeah. Then the other one is on Singapore water. They said they given examples. There's also one on the financial sector by Mr. Prasad. I will come to you. That's very interesting.
No, Singapore one is good. Prasad one is good. Go ahead.
Yeah. The Singapore one is Singapore water utility providers. The average water consumption of your neighbors in your bill to encourage your consumption of water. I think this is the way you could reduce consumption. This is one model. Do you have any comment on this?
Yeah, exactly. That's a classic example. In fact, my electricity bill, it shows me how much I consumed last year, this time, and also how much average families consume and show my again. And actually, an experiment was conducted where they sent this out and it didn't actually make a difference. It didn't actually make a difference to people's consumption. Then what they started doing was sending a little smiley face on those who were consuming less than the average. And that actually changed behavior. People thought, I'm actually doing good. So that reinforcement actually made a difference. Not just telling people, but reinforcing it through a smiley face.
Super, sir. There's a question from Mr. Shankar.
Yeah, go to Prasad.
Yeah, Shankar's one question. Then Indian Railways print on every ticket the extent of under recovery of costs from your ticket price. Not immediately actionable, but makes people more tolerant, fair. But still, the under recovery is phenomenal. Indian Railways. Do you have any suggestion for Indian Railways?
No, I'm sorry, I do not. But we have to be careful about these things because, say, in the West, in Australia, every food product has calories written on it. There's this implicit belief that people will look at it and make a conscious, count the calories and make food choices. In reality, how many of us actually do that? So just, it becomes part of the furniture. For it to act, you have to make it accessible. It's like painting those footprints to the rubbish bin. Somehow you have to bring it to people's knowledge. And that is where you need behavioral psychologists. And as I said, I'm not one.
Thank you, sir. There's a interesting question from Mr. N.K. Prasad, Pons Veterans, and he says, thank you for the lovely, excellent presentation. While humans have reflective and reflective brains, most financial service providers sell products which are not most beneficial, especially insurance. Since consumers don't use the reflective brain, bundling products, increasing annuity payments, etc., are some examples since people don't check IRR, etc. Any examples of nudging from financial regulators overseas?
There's a whole. I'm not. I'm not familiar with. There's a whole field of behavioral economics relating to financial services. In fact, I think the 2019 Nobel Prize was actually given to somebody who worked in that. But I'm sorry, I can't give you examples of people use nudging in insurance to get people not to lie on their forms, and the lemonade example is where they've used the nudging behavior to make the process simple. I mean, it takes 30 seconds to sort of get to sign up in the Lemonade app. It's an app and so on. But in terms of how to actually get people to invest more rationally, I'm sorry, I'm not an expert on that, and I can't comment.
So one last question. This is from the YouTube viewer. This question from Mr. Raghu is, India remains still a developing country and one which usually regarded as an underperformer. Could do better. If it is accepted, the question then arises as to why be this case? Was the policy adopted by the states not right? Or was it not implemented properly? Or was it a political commitment and the support for the desired course of action lacking? What could be the lesson we could learn from other countries in terms of implementing public policy for effective compliances?
It goes back to that DQ problem that I said, which is any hypothesis. In fact, it applies to all scientific hypotheses. Any hypothesis can only be tested by, the assumptions being right, so the context being right, the intervention being right, as well as the implementation being right. And it's almost impossible to say in each case which one of these is not right for the overall effect not to work. It is not that public policy in the Western world doesn't fail. We have failures all the time. But the purpose is to err and learn more so that you err and err less and less as time goes on. You learn from your mistakes is the only way in which we can progress.
Thank you, sir. We have one more minute. Yes, please go ahead, Mr. Balram, please.
No, Group Captain, you have finished?
So one last question which has come is quite interesting. If you permit me, I'll just tell him in a quickly rapid fire. Still, we got another 5 minutes to go, sir. The question is compliance of tax compliance. Some of the countries use nudge for the tax complaint. They could achieve almost 85% by indicating that if you don't pay the taxes, you'll go to prison. Now, in a country like democratic country like India, do you think similar things will work, sir?
Again, it's impossible for me to say what, because as I said, the whole idea or the concept is you come up with different interventions and you test them on a portion of the population. But it is not a question of saying you will go to prison is not nudge philosophy. Nudge philosophy is more about saying all your neighbors have paid taxes. Your taxes are paying for your roads, your police, your hospitals, your nurses. You're in the small minority who is not paying. And then the next letter would be, you are one of the 3 or 4 people who are not paying. And maybe even go to the extent, of even further identifying the person. And those are nudge techniques. To say you will go to prison is is traditional thinking.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. I'll now request Balraman to take it forward for the closing comments. In the meanwhile, I request the viewers, please, there's a poll which will come onto your screen. Please do give your feedback. Your feedbacks are very, very important to us. Now, Mr. Balraman, over to you, sir.
Yeah, actually, MS, the nudge in India is not that if you don't pay taxes, you'll go to prison, you'll go to England. You know, that is the nudge. It's a superlative presentation, MS, as only you could. You stimulated thinking, and we are still thinking. Okay, we are still thinking. And, you know, just for your information, 90% of our speakers come back and speak again. Okay. And if that is not enough, those who do it repeatedly, we even erect statues of them. Okay. And the last one, MS, what is the time now in Sydney?
It is tomorrow.
Okay. So 99.99% of your neighbors have already gone to sleep. Thank you very much. Thanks, MS. Beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Balraman. As a token of our appreciation, sir, we would like to present on your behalf masks to the people who are in need of them, because this is one way of, we thought, conveying our kind gesture, our appreciation for your taking time. You're going to the tomorrow to deliver this excellent lecture on nudging. And one more thing, what we all learn from your lecture is how to nudge our members to come and participate in a big number. We are going to think and we are going to take your views on this, and I'm quite sure it will really help us, because we can take some brilliant program, but how to nudge them and how to convince them. We have learned quite a lot today. I think we'll be using this quite effectively. Make sure that our 1,000 plus viewers today, 1,100, we want to use 10,000 plus in a short while. Once again, thanks so much to a distinguished speaker who joined us from Australia, Mr. Narayan, and also special invitees for this evening that added tremendous value. Ramya Ramesh, economist, Atul Vora, from Dallas, he joined us, and Anu Waza, HR Director and Talent Management, Ford Motors Private Limited. Thank you so much. And as usual, thank you, Mr. Balraman, your support, and what really made this evening fascinating with great insight is how you really collect the speakers and how you bring in some outstanding speaker to come and speak at MMA platform. Thank you so much, everyone, and stay safe, keep learning, and keep nudging for good things to happen in the society today. Thank you so much, and thanks, and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Balraman, you are there. I'll call you just to request you for that video. I'll just give you a call maybe after this thing is over.
Yeah.